Oklahoma, December 1944. The barracks at Camp Gruber stood dark and silent, breath visible in the cold air, frost creeping across windows like memory. 300 German prisoners lay awake in their bunks, listening to wind rattle through the pines. They expected nothing. Christmas had been dead for them since North Africa, since capture, since the world reduced itself to wire fences and guard towers. But at midnight, they heard footsteps, then voices singing in English, then light flooding through the doorways, warm and impossible. What followed would break something inside these men, not their spirits, but their certainty about who their enemies were. The winter of 1944 was a season of contradictions. In Europe, armies ground against each other in the Ardennes forests, blood-staining snow while the war entered what everyone hoped might be its final year. In the Pacific, island by island, the conflict consumed lives with mechanical efficiency. But in Oklahoma, on American soil thousands of miles from any front line, the war manifested differently in the contained spaces of prisoner camps, in the careful choreography of guards and captives, in the strange suspended reality of men held in place while history moved forward without them. Camp Gruber sat in the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, sprawling across 40,000 acres of rolling hills and dense pine forest. It had been built in 1942 as a training facility for American infantry divisions, but by 1944, it also served as a prisoner of war camp, housing German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, and France. They arrived in waves, processed through military channels, assigned numbers, stripped of weapons and insignia and any illusions about returning home soon. Among them was Klaus Becker, 26 years old, formerly of the Afrika Korps. He had been captured at Tunisia in May 1943, 18 months of captivity already behind him, enough time for the initial shock to wear away and be replaced by the dull routine of imprisoned existence. He had survived Rommel's retreat across Libya, survived the final desperate stands as the Allied vice closed, survived the certainty of death only to find himself alive in a processing center in Algiers, then on a ship across the Atlantic, then in a camp in Oklahoma, where the sky was too big and the food was too plentiful, and nothing made sense anymore. There were others. Hans Muller, a quiet carpenter from Bavaria, captured in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day. Friedrich Weber, a former schoolteacher from Dresden, taken prisoner in Sicily. Otto Schmidt, a farmer's son from Prussia, who had been captured so quickly after arriving in Italy that he had barely fired his rifle. Young men and old, educated and working class, believers and skeptics, all united by the common circumstance of being German soldiers on the wrong side of the front line when the bullets finally found them, or the opportunities for escape finally ran out. Camp Gruber treated its prisoners according to the Geneva Convention standards, which meant adequate food, shelter, medical care, and work assignments that kept them occupied without violating international law. The men worked in the camp itself, maintenance, kitchen duty, construction projects, or were contracted out to local farms. And businesses desperate for labor in a nation that had sent so many of its young men overseas. It was strange work for soldiers, this civilian labor in a country they had been trained to consider the enemy, but it filled the days and made the time pass and was infinitely preferable to the alternatives they might have faced as prisoners. The camp commandant was Colonel Robert Henderson, a career officer from Tennessee who had never seen combat but took his administrative duties seriously. He was a man who believed in rules, in proper procedure, in treating even enemy prisoners with the basic dignity the law required. His guards were a mix of older men deemed unfit for combat duty and younger ones awaiting deployment or recovering from wounds. They maintained order without excessive force, watched the prisoners with varying degrees of sympathy or suspicion, and counted the days until their own tours ended and they could return to civilian life or be sent somewhere more exciting than the pine forests of Oklahoma. Sergeant James Wilson was one of these guards. He was 42 years old, too old for infantry service, assigned to camp duty after 20 years in the Army that had been mostly peacetime routine. He had a wife and 3 children in Tulsa, a mortgage he was slowly paying down, and a fundamental decency that sometimes made his job difficult. He looked at the German prisoners and saw men, not monsters tired, homesick, beaten men who had made the mistake of being born in the wrong country at the wrong time and had survived when perhaps they shouldn't have. As Christmas approached in 1944, the camp settled into the familiar patterns of military routine with slight modifications for the season. The Americans would get special meals, passes to leave the base if they lived locally, packages from home with cookies and letters, and the small comforts that made military life bearable. The prisoners would get. Well, the prisoners would get nothing. There was no policy about celebrating enemy holidays, no requirement to acknowledge that these men might miss their families, might remember different. Christmases in different places might carry the weight of being far from home during a season that had once meant something to them. But Sergeant Wilson had an idea. It started small, just a passing thought during a conversation with his wife Margaret during his last visit home. She had been wrapping presents for their children, and the house smelled of pine from the tree they'd cut down at a local lot, and she'd asked casually how the German prisoners were doing at the camp. "Same as always," Wilson had replied. "Just waiting, existing. What will they do for Christmas?" Margaret asked, taping paper around a box that contained a toy truck for their youngest son. Wilson paused, realizing he'd never considered the question. "Nothing, I suppose. We don't celebrate their holidays." Margaret looked up, her hands stilling. "Nothing? James, that's awful. It's Christmas. They're prisoners, Maggie. Enemy prisoners. They're also men. Men with families somewhere, probably. Men who used to celebrate Christmas before all this." She went back to her wrapping, but her tone carried the weight of moral certainty that had made Wilson fall in love with her 20 years earlier. Someone should do something. Even something small. The conversation stayed with Wilson as he returned to Camp Gruber. He found himself watching the German prisoners more carefully, noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The way they moved through their days with mechanical efficiency, but no real purpose. The way their conversations stopped when guards approached, not from fear, but from the understanding that their inner lives were their own, the only private space left to them. The way some of them stared at the pine trees surrounding the camp, and Wilson realized they were probably thinking of German forests, German Christmases, German families gathered around tables that might not even exist anymore. He approached Colonel Henderson with his idea 3 weeks before Christmas. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Henderson looked up from his paperwork, removed his reading glasses. "Go ahead, Sergeant. I'd like to organize something for the German prisoners. For Christmas. Nothing elaborate. Just ... something. A tree, maybe. Some decorations. Let them have a few hours that feel different from every other day." Henderson studied him for a long moment. Why? Wilson had anticipated the question and prepared his answer. "Because it's the right thing to do, sir. Geneva Convention requires we treat them humanely. Seems to me humanity includes acknowledging they might miss their families at Christmas. And ... double quotes." He hesitated, then continued. "Might be good for morale. Ours and theirs. Show them Americans can be generous even to enemies. Might make them more cooperative, less likely to cause trouble." It was a practical argument wrapped around a moral one, and Henderson recognized both layers. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, thinking through implications and regulations and what his superiors might say if they found out. "Nothing that could be construed as fraternization," he said finally. "Nothing that compromises security. And it comes out of goodwill funds or donations, not official military budget. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "Then make it happen, Sergeant. But keep it quiet. I don't want some congressman hearing about us throwing parties for German prisoners and making it a political issue. Wilson left the colonel's office with permission and immediately began the logistical work of transforming an abstract idea into concrete reality. He spoke to other guards, gauging interest, finding allies. Most were skeptical. These were enemy soldiers. After all, men who had fought against American troops, who represented a regime that had caused immeasurable suffering. But a few understood what Wilson was trying to do, saw it not as betrayal, but as assertion of values, as proof that Americans could afford to be magnanimous when they were winning. The camp chaplain, Captain Robert Morris, became an enthusiastic supporter. He was a Methodist minister from Kansas who had volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor, believing he could serve God and country simultaneously. He had conducted services for the American personnel, but had never been authorized to do anything for the prisoners, who had their own limited religious accommodations. The idea of a Christmas gesture appealed to his fundamental faith in redemption and common humanity. "I can get donations," Morris offered. "My church back home, other churches in the area. People will contribute if they understand it's about basic human decency, not politics." Together, Wilson and Morris began quietly assembling resources. A local farmer donated a pine tree, 12 feet tall, freshly cut. The camp carpenter shop agreed to build wooden ornaments. American soldiers contributed pennies and nickels toward purchasing small gifts, nothing elaborate, just simple items like tobacco, writing paper, soap, chocolate bars. Margaret Wilson organized the officers' wives to bake cookies, hundreds of them, packed into tins that wouldn't be labeled by source, maintaining the fiction that this was official military generosity rather than personal kindness. The prisoners knew something was happening, but not what. They saw the pine tree being moved into a storage building near the main compound. They noticed increased activity around the mess hall. Guards who normally maintained professional distance seemed oddly friendly in the days leading up to December 25th. Rumors circulated in German through the barracks, perhaps a visit from Red Cross officials, perhaps news about prisoner exchanges, perhaps some change in camp policy they hadn't been informed about. Klaus Becker didn't speculate much. He had learned that hope was dangerous, that expectations led to disappointment, that the best survival strategy was to want nothing and be surprised by anything. Christmas meant nothing to him anymore anyway. His last real Christmas had been 1942 in North Africa, sharing a tin of sardines with his unit while British artillery shook the ground. Before that, 1941 in Germany, his mother's house in Munich, the smell of stolen and the sound of carols and his sister's children opening presents, while the war seemed far away and manageable, and not yet the all-consuming monster it would become. He wrote letters home when allowed, though he had no idea if they reached his family, or if his family still existed to receive them. The last confirmed news he'd had was from early 1943, mother alive, sister alive, Munich damaged but standing. After that, nothing, silence, the uncertainty that was perhaps worse than confirmed loss, because it left the imagination to fill in details that might be better or worse than reality. December 24th arrived cold and clear. The prisoners completed their usual routine's morning roll call, work assignments, lunch in the mess hall, afternoon labor, dinner, evening in the barracks. Nothing suggested this day was different from any other, except perhaps the way some guards seemed barely able to contain smiles, the way Sergeant Wilson kept checking his watch as if waiting for something. As darkness fell, the camp settled into evening routine. Lights out was scheduled for 10 p.m. The prisoners retreated to their barracks. 300 men distributed across several long wooden buildings, each man to his own bunk with its thin mattress and wool blankets. They talked in small groups about nothing important memories of home, speculation about when the war might end, complaints about the cold, anything to fill the silence before sleep. Klaus lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Munich and wondering if snow was falling there tonight, wondering if his mother was alive to see it. wondering if the house still stood or if British bombs had reduced it to rubble like so many others. Wondering if his wondering would ever end, or if this uncertainty was now the permanent condition of his existence. At 11 p.m., unexpectedly, lights flickered back on. Guards entered the barracks, not with the usual brusque efficiency of security checks, but with something else in their bearing nervousness maybe, or anticipation. Sergeant Wilson stood at the door and called out in his limited German, supplemented by gestures. Everyone up, everyone out. Formation in 5 minutes. Confusion rippled through the prisoners. Late-night formations were unusual, typically reserved for emergencies or security incidents. Men exchanged worried glances, wondering what they'd done wrong, what regulation they'd violated, what consequence was about to descend. They dressed quickly, filed outside into December cold that cut through their camp-issue coats and made breath visible as ghosts in the floodlight beams. The guards arranged them in loose rows facing the camp's central recreation building, a structure normally used for administrative purposes and occasional meetings. Its windows glowed with warm light, and as Klaus stood shivering in formation, he heard something impossible: music, singing, in English, but unmistakably a Christmas carol. The doors of the recreation building opened, and light spilled out across the frozen ground. Inside, Klaus could see what looked like decorations, colored paper chains hanging from rafters, and impossibly a Christmas tree, fully decorated, standing in the corner of the room, lights flickering on its branches. Sergeant Wilson stepped forward, and beside him stood Captain Morris in his chaplain's uniform. Wilson spoke in English, then waited for the camp's German interpreter, a young private named Schmidt, who had been born in America to German immigrant parents, to translate. "Gentlemen," Wilson began, his breath clouding in the cold. "It's Christmas Eve. We know you're far from home. We know you're prisoners. We know this year has been hard for all of us, though in different ways." He paused, letting Schmidt translate, watching the prisoners' faces shift from confusion to dawning comprehension. "Tonight, for a few hours, we want to do something different. We want to give you Christmas, not as Americans, not as guards, just as men who understand what it means to miss home during the holidays. You're invited inside. There's food, decorations, some gifts, no strings attached. No favors expected, just ... Christmas. Because even in war, some things should be sacred." The translation finished, and silence held for a long moment. 300 German prisoners stood in the Oklahoma cold, staring at their American captors, trying to process this information that contradicted everything they'd been taught about their enemies, everything they'd experienced, of captivity, everything that made sense about the world they inhabited. Then, slowly, they began to move forward. The recreation building wasn't large enough for everyone at once, so they entered in groups of 50, rotated through in shifts that would take all night. Klaus was in the third group, which meant waiting outside for nearly an hour, stamping feet against cold, watching other prisoners emerge with expressions he couldn't quite read: shock maybe, or wonder, or something that had no easy name. When his turn came, he stepped through the doors and stopped, breath catching in his chest. The room had been transformed. Paper chains in red and green stretched across the ceiling. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with wooden ornaments painted in bright colors, with strings of popcorn, with a star at its top made from tin foil that caught the light. Tables had been set up along the walls, covered with food, cookies, cakes, fruit, chocolate, coffee, things that exceeded standard prisoner rations by such magnitude that it seemed like hallucination. And in the center of the room, a group of American soldiers stood holding songbooks, and they began to sing. Asterisk, silent night, holy night, asterisk, asterisk. All is calm, all is bright, asterisk. The melody was universal, transcending language. And after the first verse, one of the German prisoners joined in, singing in German, then another, then more, until the room filled with two languages intertwining, German and English, creating harmony from war. Asterisk still nart, helig not asterisk asterisk ales SCHLG isum whacked asterisk. Klaus felt something break inside his chest. Not his spirit that had been broken and rebuilt too many times to break again. Something else. Some wall he built between himself and feeling. Some protective barrier that had let him survive captivity by treating it as merely continuation of combat by other means. Guards as enemies in different uniforms, imprisonment as just another battlefield. But enemies didn't do this. Enemies didn't put up Christmas trees and sing carols and provide cookies baked by their wives for the men who had been trying to harm them months earlier. Enemies didn't create beauty in barracks, didn't acknowledge shared humanity, didn't care if prisoners missed home at Christmas. The singing continued through several carols, both languages mixing, voices finding harmony where politics had found only conflict. When the music ended, Captain Morris stepped forward and spoke, Schmidt translating. There are gifts on the tables, small things. Take what you want. And there's food, more than enough. You have 1 hour. Eat, rest, remember what it feels like to have Christmas. Then we'll rotate the next group in. The prisoners moved forward tentatively, still half expecting the illusion to shatter, the cruelty to reveal itself. But the cookies were real. The chocolate was real. The small packages on the tables, tobacco, soap, writing paper, playing cards, were real. Guards stood at the edges of the room, not as jailers, but as hosts, awkward in this unfamiliar role, but committed to it. Klaus took a cookie, bit into it, tasted butter and sugar and cinnamon, and someone's kitchen in America. Someone somewhere ovens worked and ingredients were available, and people still made beautiful. Things for no reason except that beauty mattered. Tears welled in his eyes without warning. He tried to stop them, embarrassed, but around him other men were crying too, grown soldiers weeping into cookies, while American guards looked away to grant them privacy. Hans Muller, the carpenter, stood before the Christmas tree touching the wooden ornaments with careful fingers, recognizing craftsmanship, understanding the work that had gone into creating these small perfect things. Friedrich Weber, the schoolteacher, was reading aloud from a card on the wall that contained the lyrics to O Tannenbaum in German, his voice breaking on familiar words that connected him to a past that felt impossibly distant. Otto Schmidt, the farmer's son, was eating apple pie with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was tasting his mother's kitchen, his family's table, everything he'd lost. The hour passed both too quickly and too slowly, time becoming elastic in the way it does during moments that matter. Klaus sat with several other prisoners, eating cookies, drinking coffee, talking quietly in German about Christmases they remembered. Not the war years, but before childhood memories of snow and family and a feeling of safety that had seemed permanent until it wasn't. My mother made Stollen every year, Klaus said softly. She would start days in advance, soaking the fruit, preparing the dough. The whole house would smell like Christmas. My sister and I would try to sneak pieces before Christmas Eve, and my mother would pretend to be angry, but we knew she wasn't really. I remember Christmas markets, Hans offered. In Munich. The stalls selling toys and decorations and roasted almonds. The smell of Glowen, the snow on the cobblestones. Taking my daughter, holding her hand while she looked at everything with such wonder. They were quiet then, each man lost in his own past, each carrying the weight of not knowing if those places still existed, if those people still lived, if any of that world could be recovered, or if it was gone forever, replaced by this strange present where enemy guards gave them Christmas and grown men cried over cookies. When their hour ended, they filed back outside into the cold. Klaus looked back once at the warm lit building, at the Christmas tree, visible through the window, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Not for captivity, not for war, not for any of the circumstances that had brought him here, but for this moment, this unexpected kindness, This reminder that humanity could survive even when everything else was stripped away. The rotations continued through the night. Group after group entered the recreation building, experienced their hour of Christmas, emerged changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate. By dawn, all 300 prisoners had been through, and the American guards who had organized this were exhausted, but satisfied, having witnessed something they knew was important, even if they couldn't fully explain why. Christmas Day itself was quieter. The prisoners returned to normal routines, but something had shifted. They moved with less of the heavy resignation that had characterized their previous months. They spoke more freely with guards who no longer seemed quite so much like enemies. The camp felt different, the atmosphere subtly transformed by the recognition that the men on both sides of the wire were just that men, capable of kindness and cruelty, both but choosing in this instance to reach across the divide that war had created. Klaus spent Christmas Day writing letters. He wrote to his mother, though he didn't know if she would ever receive it, telling her about Oklahoma, about the pine forests, about American guards who put up Christmas trees for German prisoners. He wrote to his sister, describing the cookies and the carols and the strange miracle of enemies singing together in different languages but same melody. "I don't know what this means," he wrote. "I don't know if it changes anything about the war, or about going home, or about any of the big things, but it changed something in me. I had forgotten that people could be kind just for the sake of kindness. I had forgotten that Christmas could mean something beyond memory and loss. Last night, American soldiers reminded me of that. Enemy soldiers reminded me that I'm still human, still capable of feeling something other than survival. I don't have words for how much that matters." He sealed the letters knowing they might never be delivered, but writing them anyway, because the act itself mattered, the reaching out across distance and uncertainty, and the fog of war that separated him from everyone he'd ever loved. In the guards' quarters, Sergeant Wilson sat with Captain Morris and several other Americans who had helped organize the night. They drank coffee and talked about what they'd witnessed, the tears, the singing, the transformation of the recreation, building from military space to something approaching sacred. "I didn't expect that," Wilson admitted. The crying. Grown men breaking down over cookies and Christmas trees. Morris nodded slowly. "I did, actually. Or hoped for it, at least. That's what happens when you remind people they're human. When you give them permission to feel again. These men have been living in survival mode for months or years. Everything focused on just getting through each day. And suddenly we give them beauty, kindness, Christmas, all the things that make life worth living, rather than just surviving. Of course they cried. What else could they do?" "Do you think it mattered?" one of the younger guards asked. "I mean, really mattered? They're still prisoners. We're still at war. Tomorrow, everything goes back to normal." "It mattered," Wilson said with certainty. "Maybe not in ways we can measure or quantify, but it mattered. We showed them and maybe reminded ourselves that even in war, humanity is a choice we can make, that we can choose kindness over cruelty, generosity over vindictiveness, recognition of shared humanity over dehumanization of enemies. That's not nothing. That might be everything, actually." The weeks that followed Christmas 1944 saw subtle changes in Camp Gruber. The relationship between guards and prisoners remained professional, bounded by regulations and military necessity, but with an underlying current of mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Prisoners worked more cooperatively. Guards treated them with more consideration. The camp functioned more smoothly. Violence and tension diminished, replaced by something approaching peaceful coexistence. The war, of course, continued. News filtered in about the Battle of the Bulge, about Allied advances, about cities falling and lines shifting and all the vast machinery of conflict grinding forward toward some eventual conclusion. The prisoners at Camp Gruber remained removed from these events, spectators to their own history, waiting to learn what would become of them when the shooting finally stopped. But something had changed for them that Christmas Eve, something fundamental about how they understood their captors, their situation, their own humanity in the context of war. They had been given a gift that transcended the physical items on those tables. They had been given recognition. Recognition that they were men, not just enemy soldiers. Recognition that they carried losses and memories and hopes just like anyone else. Recognition that even in the machinery of war, there was room for the kind of basic human kindness that makes life bearable. Years later, when the war was over and the prisoners had been repatriated, when Klaus Becker returned to Munich to find his mother alive and his sister Semli surviving in the city, rebuilding itself from ruins, he would tell the story of Christmas 1944 in Oklahoma. He would describe the surprise, the decorations, the singing in 2 languages, the cookies that made grown men weep. That was when I understood, he would say, that we had been lied to, about Americans, about the war, about everything. They had told us Americans were brutal, that we would be mistreated as prisoners, that we should expect only suffering if captured. But instead, we found men who gave us Christmas, who acknowledged our humanity, even when we were enemies, who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier and perhaps more justified. The story spread. Other prisoners told their versions to their families, their friends, their children born after the war who would grow up in a different Germany, a changed world. The Christmas at Camp Gruber became one of those small legends that circulate among those who experienced it, proof that even in the darkest times there are moments of light, instances of grace, choices for compassion that ripple outward in ways impossible to measure, but profound nonetheless. Sergeant Wilson returned to civilian life in 1945, went back to his wife and children in Tulsa, resumed the ordinary routines of peacetime existence. But he kept the memory of that Christmas, the sight of German prisoners singing carols and crying over cookies, the feeling of having done something right in a time when so much was wrong. When his children asked him about the war, about his service, he didn't tell them about battles or heroism or dramatic moments. He told them about Christmas Eve 1944, about pine trees and paper chains, and the choice to treat enemies as human beings deserving of dignity and kindness. That was my war, he would say. Not combat, not glory, just that one night when we decided to give Christmas to men who expected nothing. I'm prouder of that than I would be of any medal or commendation, because that night we proved something important, that Americans, when we're at our best, choose generosity over vindictiveness. We choose to see humanity even in enemies. We choose to build rather than just destroy. That's who we should be. That's who we were, at least for one night in Oklahoma in 1944. The recreation building at Camp Gruber was eventually dismantled, the camp itself decommissioned, the physical spaces returned to other uses or nature. But what happened there, that Christmas Eve remained, encoded in memory, passed down through stories. Proof that even in total war, even when nations were destroying each other with industrial efficiency, individual human beings could still make different choices, could still create moments of beauty and kindness and recognition that transcended the larger forces trying to reduce everyone to categories of friend or enemy, us or them. 300 German prisoners expected nothing on Christmas 1944. They got cookies and carols and Christmas trees. They got tears and singing and temporary transformation of a military camp into something approaching sacred space. They got reminded that they were human beings, not just prisoners, not just enemies, not just numbers to be processed and contained until the war decided their fates. And in receiving those gifts, they gave something back. They gave their captors the opportunity to be generous, to prove their values through action rather than just rhetoric, to demonstrate that American ideals about human dignity and worth weren't just propaganda, but could be lived choices even in the context of guarding enemy soldiers. It was a small thing, really. One night, one Christmas. Some decorations and cookies and singing. Nothing that changed the war's outcome. Nothing that appeared in history books or official records. Nothing that could be easily quantified or measured against the vast death and destruction that defined those years. But it mattered. To the men who experienced it, it mattered enormously. And maybe that's enough. Maybe history is made not just of the big dramatic moments, the battles and treaties and turning points, but also of these small choices for kindness, these individual decisions to treat enemies as human beings, these momentary transcendences of the categories that war creates. Maybe Christmas 1944 at Camp Gruber was just that, a reminder that even in the worst of times, there's still room for the best of humanity. That cruelty is a choice, but so is kindness. That war requires us to see enemies, but humanity requires us to see people. And that sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we can choose the latter even in the context of the former. The prisoners went back to their barracks that night. The guards went back to their posts. The war continued. But something had changed. Something had been proven. Something had been given and received that couldn't be taken back. And for one night in Oklahoma, in 1944, 300 German prisoners and a handful of American guards had together created something that defied the logic of war, a moment of peace, a gesture of grace, a Christmas that made grown men weep not from sorrow, but from the sudden overwhelming recognition that kindness still existed, that humanity still mattered, that even in darkness there could be light.